The Legend of Zelda has never failed to astound fans with its incredible presentation, both visually and audibly. My name is Sarks, and I'd like to take you all on a two-part series where we dive into these important elements of this popular franchise in order to shed light on their relevance to storytelling, and what this could mean for future titles. In this first part, I'd like to mainly cover the visual elements of the Zelda series, and discuss some potentialities that could lead to deeper speculative discussion, and open some doors for the direction of the franchise. First thing I'd like to point out is the obvious elephant in the room, the Zelda timeline. Now, this has been a pretty nasty beast for the majority of the fanbase, but I, personally, have had no qualms with it since Breath of the Wild's release. How does this relate to the video? Well, an argument or two will presuppose that Breath of the Wild takes place as the latest entry to the child timeline. If you don't know what I mean by that, or are perplexed at the mention of multiple timelines in Zelda, then I suggest you do some outside research to know what I'm talking about here. There are plenty of YouTube videos on the subject. For the sake of this video, I will be very definitively presupposing the official placement of Breath of the Wild into the child timeline because of the daunting amount of evidence the game gives towards it. I already hear some of you screaming, "Convergence!" But trust me, I tried to espouse the same idea at one point, but there is simply no logical precedent for it. And, of course, the denunciation of the popular convergence theory is also particularly relevant to this video, as certain artistic and stylistic choices the developers made imply some form of continuity, and multiple interpretations of completely different events taking place in separate timelines cannot all exist simultaneously. It's ridiculous. Sorry. I refuse to believe that Hyrule was flooded and also not flooded, that Link was defeated and also victorious, that Ganon was sealed and also resurrected. With that out of the way, let's begin by discussing a central theme regarding the Legend of Zelda series. I know this has been discussed before, but bear with me. The very title of the franchise implies some form of bygone age, hence the Legend of Zelda. But is this just to procure some form of medieval fantasy story without having to explain too much how long ago it took place? Or does it imply something about the story itself? Well, judging by the fact that the franchise isn't just called Zelda, but instead the Legend of Zelda, and how the games seem to have stories that are more or less unrelated to each other, the name begins to make more sense. Of course, one thing remains consistent throughout each title, save for Triforce Heroes: the existence of a Princess Zelda. The Legend of Zelda series is really just a series of legends which concerns the constant battle between the forces of evil and good, spearheaded by the malicious Ganon, or Demise, and the Princess Zelda respectively. So this much is clear, but what does this have to do with art direction? Well, if we really think of every single Zelda game as a contained legend, we have to then consider, who is the orator behind these stories? I mean, who it is really isn't important, but if we acknowledge that there is an individual spinning these legends, then we have some interesting analysis on our hands. Especially if we consider the art direction, which contributes largely to how the story is propounded to us. Noticeably, every Zelda game seems to have a pretty distinct art direction. I mean, some of them are closer together than others, but for the most part, every entry has an incredibly distinct stylistic direction that separates them from each other and makes them all individually unique. Now, if we're considering the yarn spinner in all this, it would be logical to observe that each distinct art style found in every game implies different perspective, different artistic interpretation, which then further implies a different mind behind every legend. The Legend of Zelda can then be described as, using this logic, a collection of legends describing the different chapters in the history of Hyrule told by a variety of different lore keepers, each in different ways, each with unique interpretations. As we know well, human interpretation is never a perfect one-to-one retelling of whatever it is we interpret. So it would also suffice to say that within these legends, because of the fallibility of the lore keepers, obvious consistency issues will arise, and perhaps even downright fabrications or revisions can spring up. That is, the exploration of ideas in history that never really occurred. This is all quite a lot to process, but I hope this makes sense so far. But while I still have you engaged, hopefully, it would be important to note an interesting fact concerning the supposed lore keepers. Their very existence and the implication of personal interpretation seriously begs the question: do we really know exactly how the Kingdom of Hyrule and its inhabitants look? Like, actually really look? Well, no, actually. We aren't actually aware, due to the lack of personal involvement with these stories, how anything really looks in this world. We don't know the true face of Ganondorf, we don't know the real beauty of the Princess Zelda, we don't even know the heroic visage of the hero himself. All we have are interpretations. This is where it gets interesting. Notice how in every game that includes these characters, these locales, there are certain levels of consistency that we can pick up on, even if there are deviations. There are things that remain recognizable throughout each interpretation. What are some things that immediately stick out in this way? Well, obviously the green tunic is a good place to start. That's always been the same, no matter what. There have been minor detail changes here and there, but it is always the same. The blonde hair? Yeah, that stuck around too. Same thing with Zelda, although the royal family hasn't always exclusively expressed that perfect golden hue as seen in the various interpretations here, Twilight Princess Zelda being a huge one. What else? Well, we've had Ganon as our third recurring character for the most part, and perhaps the most distinctive trait of his would be his red hair. Characteristic of the Gerudo tribe, perhaps, but we've seen this in his other forms as well. Notice, though, how there are a few instances where Ganon was not depicted with any red hair, or when Link and Zelda weren't depicted with golden blonde hair, or, in relation to the kingdom itself, green rupees were not valued as 1 rupee. Well, this feeds into the concept that I like to call overarching interpretive synergy. In other words, what are the things that remain basically the same across all interpretations? This concept doesn't just help us pinpoint those consistencies, but it implies that whatever remains consistent is probably the closest to the real thing. Meaning, yes, Link's tunic is based on the overarching synergy of every interpretation, most likely green in reality. Same with the royal family's hair color, same with the line of Demise's reincarnations, and same with the colors and values associated with rupees. This is why the study of artistic interpretations is so darn interesting, because you can actually theorize and speculate on actual narrative content using this method. Like the Rito tribe, for example. In Wind Waker they look like this, and in Breath of the Wild they look like this. Different interpretations, most likely different lore keepers. But one thing remains true. They are a winged, humanoid species that generally enjoy conglomerating in higher elevations. Some of you may be saying to yourselves, well, yes, but Breath of the Wild and Wind Waker are in 2 separate timelines if you think that Breath of the Wild is in the child timeline. Precisely, you'd be right to say that. And I reply, so what? If there are multiple concurrent timelines, all telling different stories from within the same world, why on earth would that mean that suddenly entire races of people don't exist anymore because of the timeline split? The timeline split is a narrative split. It doesn't erase whole subcultures or locales. By that logic, we can say that the era of decline, the third split, actually contains the Rito as an existing species also. They just aren't relevant to the events that take place in that timeline. I just needed to mention this because for some reason or another, it is deemed a good argument to say, well, the Rito weren't found in any of the child timeline games, so it has to be the adult timeline, which isn't the case at all. But I'm getting off track here, so let's look at how different interpretations from different timelines can be possible in the first place. Well, there are two possibilities. Either 1, there are various lore keepers riddled about, and they all handle the stories they are responsible for telling, serving as witnesses that live among the Hylians, or 2, there are overseers that exist outside of the physical realm, and somehow, through their omnipotence, are able to witness all the events in every single timeline, and are therefore able to craft legends digestible to us. I personally have to say the second option is cool, and does hold definite merit. But the first option has some merit too, as I'll explain. Remember that rant I had about people and locations remaining in existence despite the timeline split? Case in point here, folks. The Legend of Zelda Four Swords Adventures and the Wind Waker games are in separate timelines, the adult and child, and yet they share the same art direction and stylistic choices across the board. Same lore keeper existing in two separate timelines, thus experiencing two different stories. The original Four Swords is what started the trend, if we want to be technical, but the same art style split into two separate timelines indicates that this same person is just recounting different events through his or her perspective. Now, mind you, the adult timeline lorekeeper certainly must be an old guy, having not only experienced the original Four Swords, but apparently Ocarina of Time, the Great Flood, the events of Wind Waker, the events of Phantom Hourglass, and the events of Spirit Tracks. This really doesn't matter too much, as really lorekeepers don't necessarily have to be of human or Hylian descent. They could be those that deal closely with Hyrule, like the Sheikah, the Children of the Forest, or the Great Deku Tree himself, who aren't bound to the same age restrictions that Hylians are. Plus, there isn't ever a real barometer for how old a Hylian can get. I mean, Nico was an adult in Wind Waker, and he showed up still kicking in Spirit Tracks just fine. Perhaps it's the genes? Anyway. Whatever the case, it is clear that the same orator is responsible for games that look stylistically identical to one another, so exemplifying the concept that people can exist concurrently throughout every timeline just fine. But this doesn't end here. No, considering this logic, there's one glaringly obvious problem with the hero is defeated and adult timelines. Variety. The adult timeline really has it worse off. What certainly makes an account more credible. Just one person giving his spiel on everything that happened, or multiple accounts from varying sources, all giving generally a continuous story with minor deviations here and there. Well, if you decided the second option, you'd be correct, and that's exactly the problem with these two timelines. They lack variety of sources. The adult timeline literally only has a single art style across all of its games, meaning only one lorekeeper was responsible for the entire story beyond Wind Waker. This leaves a lot of room for error, so really we may have very little idea of what truly transpired during that time, unless we get another game in that timeline that confirms these events in one way or another, and has a completely different art direction. The Era of Decline is an improvement to the continuous story, as there can be discerned two different hands within the promotional artwork for those games, that of Zelda 1 and Link's Adventure as one consistent style, and Link to the Past, the Oracle games, and Link's Awakening as yet another. So the Era of Decline oddly holds more credence than the adult timeline, while the child timeline remains to have the most variety out of the three branching paths containing Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, Four Swords Adventures, and Breath of the Wild. This is not to mention, of course, that before the timeline split, there are also three different styles across Skyward Sword, Minish Cap, and Four Swords, and Ocarina of Time. In total, this amounts to about 7 total Hyrule historians, the official lore keepers holding the supposed knowledge concerning the history of the Kingdom of Hyrule, A pretty nice number, if you ask me. I was really considering writing this whole video in order to point out every single deviation among the 7 historians, but really, at this point, I'll give you one huge example and let you do most of the research yourselves. Cracking open my Hyrule Historia along with my arts and artifacts to analyze every minute difference across all styles was such an enriching and fresh experience for me, and it really does open so many doors for the speculative community as to what was, what is, and what may be in the Zelda universe. I wouldn't want to take that experience away from any interested viewers, and I certainly wouldn't want to tell you what to think either. So much individual speculation can be spawned from this method of analysis, and it would be foolish of me to say what is or what is not the case when someone else may have a much better analysis in some areas of study. So I contribute this methodology to the Zelda interpretive community. Study the 7 known historians and discover new potentialities in the Zelda lore by comparing and cross-referencing their work. With the explanation of the method itself out of the way, let's try and apply it somewhere just to leave off for today. Let's see. Here's a juicy one. The ever-elusive Sheikah tribe. It may not be easy to see at first, but this hidden society is riddled about Hyrule's history. Their true nature, before I began this research, was foggy for me, as really the only timeline out of the present 3 that expounds upon them is the child timeline, majorly in Breath of the Wild, or at least, so I thought. You see, if we look at the artwork these proverbial historians provided for us, in every timeline there is at least one hint towards their existence. But, of course, let's not get ahead of ourselves and try to find written evidence too. Let's see what we can find by applying knowledge of the historians in regards to their artwork by itself. You'd be surprised. There's a hell of a rabbit trail. Before we start looking for the Sheikah, what are some things to be looking for in order to find hints towards their involvement? Well, the infamous eye symbol would be a great place to start. Colors also help too. So let's say, since the only known Sheikah have always been portrayed with white hair, we'll look for something like that too. Remember, the overarching interpretive synergy is what we're looking for here. Before the timeline split, we already see the obvious one, Ocarina of Time, where the Sheikah really made their debut. Okay, easy. Skyward Sword had an obvious reference too, being that Impa was involved greatly in that story and was clearly a member of the Sheikah. That's 2 sources. Beyond the split, we have Majora's Mask, where the Mask of Truth clearly bears the same symbol, and it is said to be passed down from the Sheikah themselves. Twilight Princess? Well, I'll get to that in a second. I don't think I need to mention specifics for Breath of the Wild either. That's pretty self-explanatory. What about other timelines? Well, you Adept fans will know that there certainly are visual references to the Sheikah in both the adult and defeated timelines. Very subtle, almost indiscernible references, but they are there. Let's start with the defeated timeline. In Ocarina of Time, it was said that the Sheikah owned Kakariko Village, but Impa allowed Hylians to inhabit it later on. Kakariko Village is present in A Link to the Past, as well as A Link Between Worlds. But this is weak evidence, as not only is it not visual, tangible proof, Breath of the Wild is the only game to associate the eye symbol with Kakariko. Not quite enough to go on here, but moving on to the Oracle games, things start to get really interesting. Impa is present in these games, but unfortunately we do not see the color of her hair. The headdress she does wear is white, like the color Sheikah hair would normally be, but this still isn't good enough for me at least. Things start to look bleak, since there's no mention of Kakariko Village or even the Sheikah in the game whatsoever. But we aren't going by word of mouth, are we? No, friends, there indeed is a reference to the Sheikah, and it is found in the Sorceress of Shadows, Varen. The symbol is on a villain? It does bear heavy resemblance. Notice the teardrop? Yes, this certainly seems Sheikah, but the teardrop is going the wrong way. Wait a minute. Where else have we seen this before? That's right, the Yiga clan. Their symbol is intended to represent the Sheikahs, only intentionally reversed to denote their opposite nature. And what's this? A Gerudo symbol as well? Well, she does have the tell-all red hair. That's a staple trait of the Gerudo people. Plus, if we're to draw a line with the reversed symbol and Sheikah defectors, where were the Yiga located in Breath of the Wild? That's right, tucked away under the Gerudo Highlands. And multiple sources here make the visual link between evil Sheikah and the Gerudo. Interesting. Let's take this further. Since we've discovered a link between the Gerudo and the Sheikah defectors, where else can we look for references to the Gerudo to see if this is further visually supported by additional historians? Twilight Princess also had a Gerudo desert and contained perhaps the most infamous Gerudo of all, Ganondorf. Wind Waker also had a Ganon, who directly stated that his affiliation was also tied to the Gerudo people. There doesn't appear to be any real references to the Sheikah anywhere in sight, though. I mean, what other visual criteria could we use that is directly related to the Sheikah people in order to further pinpoint them? How about the ancient Sheikah technology in Breath of the Wild? That's really as Sheikah as it can get, considering some of the first Sheikah were said to have developed the tech themselves. What makes the Sheikah tech visually distinct? It's kind of a no-brainer, neon blue and grayish tones. All the shrines have this aesthetic, and all the benign guardians do too. I'll stop explaining. You know where I'm going with this. The Twilight people and their realm bear this same color scheme, and they're found in Twilight Princess. But before you say it's a stretch, hear me out. The entrance to the Twilight Realm is found in Gerudo Desert, in the Arbiter's grounds. There's a loose link we've established to Sheikah tech and the Gerudo. To further prove that there's a link, can we discern any Sheikah references in the Twilight Realm or its denizens? Absolutely. The eye on Xant's throne, the hilt of Xant's sword, on the back of the fused shadow, the entrances to Twilight-covered areas, multiple places around the Palace of Twilight itself, the list goes on. What's more, Xant appears to have some derivation of the Gerudo insignia plastered on his robe. Not to mention that the only time the Sheikah tech was a different color was when it was infected with Ganon's malice, and that color was either red or a bright orange, which is the exact same for all of the malicious Twilight and the overtaken Palace of Twilight. Oh, it goes further, friends. The fused shadow, when it is controlled by Midna, emits a bluish color, a benign symbol of Sheikah technology. But wait, it was said that the ancient interlopers attempted to use their magic, which manifested in the fused shadow, in order to rule the sacred realm. So you might think the fused shadow can't possibly be of benign Sheikah origin. Right again. Well, remember, the color associated with Ganon's malice is orange. Again, I'm sure you see where this is going. If we make the assertion that the interlopers, or the ones responsible for the creation of the fused shadow, were actually Sheikah, then we have a good foundation for why the color emitted has closer association with uninfected Sheikah tech. But who were these interlopers? And if they were Sheikah, why would they commit such an act of treason towards the goddess? You know the answer. They weren't Sheikah. They were Yiga, the only other Sheikah defectors in the franchise so far, and now we have two historians confirming their existence for us. The fact that the Twilight Realm was just a reservoir for all ancient Sheikah technology further lends credence to why all of the supposedly evil Sheikah symbols associated with the Twilight aren't reversed upside down. They were just changed a different color after the rule of Xant, the Usurper King, underling of Ganondorf himself. And if that isn't enough visual evidence in the artwork, the same two historians also give us their own interpretations of the Guardians. Don't believe me? Look at the Midna-controlled fused shadow beside a Guardian and tell me the resemblance isn't there. Both have cylindrical, pod-like heads, several serpentine appendages that serve as legs with finger-like structures at the ends, and both use shafts of pure light energy to attack foes. What I see here are two different interpretations provided by two of our kind lore keepers who spun the Breath of the Wild and Twilight Princess legends respectively. So again, we know generally what the Guardians look like, but we cannot say for certain, as there are obvious distinctions between the two interpretations. But the fact that two different historical interpreters designed an entity so similar is telling of its existence and solidifies this Sheikah machine into the lore. Oh, right. I can't forget the adult timeline, and thankfully the correlation here really only stops at Wind Waker, so I can give my voice a rest. Even those who have keen observation skills will tell you that the symbol of the Sheikah is all but missing in this game. But I'm here to tell you that is certainly almost the case, but it isn't. There are only two places where you can find the symbol in the entire game. One location way more significant than the other. Starting with the lesser, we have a disgruntled mailman by the name of Baito, who has the symbol tattooed on his back. And that's it. Nothing much else to go off. And just based off the color of his skin, he's probably of Hylian descent, but that doesn't really matter and has no legitimate substance. I tried to link him with the postman from previous games, but even his affiliation is unknown. The symbol on his uniform is unique to him. So, I guess this mysterious man will just have to stay mysterious, for the sake of this video at least. The other appearance the symbol makes is perhaps of ultimate significance, as it appears on either side of the door to Ganon's lair in the Forsaken Fortress. Now, we know that the fortress was overrun, hence the name Forsaken Fortress, and we also know that the fortress by itself is separate from Ganon's lair entirely. Notice how perched on top of the fortress we find an old ship that serves as Ganon's residence in the game. So the rest of the fortress itself is irrelevant as far as this study goes. What's important is the entrance to the ship containing the Sheikah symbols. We find also that skulls and blades surround the entrance, indicating that either they were put up by their new resident, or, more likely, we believe what Tetra told us in reference to the design of the fortress. She mentions it previously belonged to yet another band of pirates separate from her own. Well, that makes sense, considering the aesthetic doesn't really seem to fit Ganon. But there still remains the question of the Sheikah insignias. Well, based upon our knowledge of the Sheikah, we can easily suggest that they have always had a deep connection with the Standing Princess, the incarnation of the goddess Hylia. In Wind Waker, Tetra and her band of pirates actually turn out to be descendants of the royal family, and Tetra is revealed to inherit the Triforce of Wisdom, thus solidifying her as the true princess. The only real pirates in the game are in direct relation to the royal family, so it would ultimately make sense that these other pirates have some association with the Kingdom of Hyrule, and the Sheikah symbols on this derelict ship atop the fortress further reveal that they may have been the last remaining Sheikah after the Great Flood. Thus, now revealing a depressing fact. Ganon resides within the ship, which presumably contained the remnants of the surviving tribe, which must mean Ganon has all but extinguished the Sheikah and taken control of their old creation. Which, by the way, sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? Yes, well, this is why the adult timeline is perhaps the least credible of the three, primarily because the concept of Ganon taking Sheikah creations under siege remains intact, but it is illustrated in a completely new way. Considering there is only one historian in charge of the entirety of the adult timeline, it may well be that this timeline is a unique, stylistic interpretation of the idea of Ganon's malicious tendency to possess whatever the Sheikah create. And since children love to hear light-hearted tales of swashbuckling pirates, it wouldn't be far off to assume that the historian we're dealing with in this timeline is dealing with a much younger audience, evidenced further still by how cartoony the art style is. So, as I said, the adult timeline remains to be the least credible, and this evidences that we may actually know very little about the true story of the adult timeline. So, before closing, I'd like to briefly list some additional stylistic details that are relevant to the discussion on the Sheikah within the three timelines, but found no solid place in the example I just provided. Firstly, Varen is widely theorized to actually have a stronger connection with the Twilight than the Gerudo, and this is evidenced by her bluish complexion combined with her red hair. It is possible still that she may be the Oracle historian's interpretation of Zant, the Usurper King, considering the visual association with the Gerudo and the Twilight. Next, it should be noted that the aforementioned door leading to Ganon's lair also depicts an image that strikingly resembles that of a guardian, complete with matching horn-like structures as well as a tentacle-like underside that could only indicate the legs of the Sheikah automaton. Next, Godon, the boss at the very end of the Tower of Gods dungeon, is also highly reminiscent of ancient Sheikah technology, featuring the classic blue and black design, with eyes being a prominent component attached to the hands. Seeing as how this boss is found in the Tower of the Gods and the Sheikah's obvious affiliation with the goddess Hylia, it may reveal to us that the source of the Sheikah's technology came from the gods, perhaps in the form of unlimited energy, advanced artificial intelligence, or both. This has no stylistic significance, but in the figurine entry for Godon, it names him the Great Arbiter, which was the same term used to name the Arbiter's grounds that led to the Twilight Realm, which bears aesthetic synergy with Godon's design. Lastly, when Zelda dons the Twilight Hood in Twilight Princess to conceal herself, we can find a Sheikah eye on the back of the hood, possibly one of the strongest indicators of the connection between the Sheikah and the Twilight people. Alrighty, so that's it for today, everyone. Thank you all for watching. This concludes the visual segment of our two-part comprehensive artistic Zelda analysis. Please stay tuned for the follow-up video, as well as more videos concerning other things game-related. Please also leave comments if you're interested to continue the discussion or share your findings using this method of analysis. Thanks again for watching. Stay brave.